Hello and welcome to another episode of a podcast. Today I'm joined by Alex, CEO of Transfer Drug Policy UK. Alex, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, no, great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Alex, I'll start off with an interesting question. Why did you want to become the CEO of this organization?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've worked sort of mostly in campaigning in the third sector sort of my whole life really, and well, my whole adult life, and various other roles I've done in organisations I've been involved in have been kind of adjacent to drug policy.
Right.
I sort of see drug policy as one of the last areas or the few areas where the actual UK government policy is so far removed from the evidence and from people's lives that I sort of wanted to get involved and try and change that.
Oh, fascinating. What but when you say it's so far removed from the evidence, why do you think that is?
Yeah, so I mean, the so-called war on drugs has existed well in the UK since 1971, when the Drugs Act was passed, or in the US it was around then when Nixon made the famous reference to the war on drugs, and it's failed spectacularly. Successive governments, both Labour and Conservative, seem to be intent on doubling down on the same approach, but it's costing an absolute fortune. Drug deaths have increased now in the UK for 9 consecutive years, and drug use also increases, pretty much every year in the UK as well. So it's a policy that politicians seem committed to, but it fails, and it's failed spectacularly. And I should say, it destroys people's lives, not just people who die as a result of drug use, but also people who get criminalized.
Is there any way you could still man an argument for the reasons of criminalizing? Like, do you see any advantages of criminalizing drugs?
I mean, my only, and I guess I don't want to spend too much time trying to think of arguments for the opposition, but I think the arguments that people come up with is that drug use is wrong, drug use is bad. I mean, even recently we had the government banning nitrous oxide because of littering, which to me is so absurd because littering is already illegal, and we don't ban sort of takeaways because people leave takeaway cartons on the floor, and as a dog owner, we don't ban dogs because people don't clean up their dog mess. So yeah, banning nitrous oxide and potentially criminalizing thousands and thousands of young people simply because the metal canisters that you see on the floor are deemed antisocial behaviour is kind of another example of how sort of warped drug policy is. But I mean, I suppose there might be moral reasons. People might think this is wrong. The law should send a sort of message to people. But I've been convinced by those arguments.
Oh yeah, I felt like smashing my head against the locker when I saw Rishi Sunak giving that speech. It's so frustrating, and what you expect it from right-wing politicians like the Conservatives, but on the other side we have Keir Starmer, who equally is just he has a very tough stance on drugs and supports war on drugs. Do you see any sign of hope from politicians in the UK in terms of a potential change in direction? Is there anyone that gives you some hope?
So it's a difficult question, and my part of my background has been in Labour politics, and I'm a vocal critic of Keir Starmer's position on drug policy and other things actually. Yeah. But there is hope in the sense that I do think public opinion is changing significantly, and actually, if you look at polls, certainly in cities, certainly London for sure, more than half people support legalization of cannabis, legal regulation of cannabis, and in the international sense, around the world now, 500 million people are living in legal cannabis jurisdictions. So I believe, even though the main parties in the UK are sort of talking tough and, as you say, doubling down on the failed war on drugs narratives, I do think the pressure is building. Germany are now about to legally regulate cannabis. And in the UK, we do have pockets of good practice around the country where police forces are deciding to, divert people from being arrested. We've got, innovative practice that's kind of about harm reduction rather than, just throwing people in jail for using drugs or possessing drugs. But I agree that it does sometimes feel a little bit hopeless when you've got the two main party leaders, the Prime Minister and leader of the opposition, basically singing from the same hymn sheet. And when Keir Starmer used to be Director of Public Prosecution, as far as I'm concerned, he either knows that what he's saying is total nonsense, and doing it for sort of populist reasons, which is not good, or he has a very strange worldview that that is kind of alien to me, really.
Yeah, he seems to have this obsession with cannabis. I've seen him speak about it in quite some depth. Alex, I've asked this question to my last two guests on my podcast. It's been about the war on drugs. For 50 years, this has been a failed policy. And if you look back in history, if there's ever been a policy that's failed so badly, usually the public holds the government to account, boots them out, and they get highly scrutinized in the media. Now, as I said, this has been going on for 50 years, this policy, and it's clearly failed in the social department, the economic department, just this cascade of negative consequences. Why do you think it's persisted, and why are people not really pushed back?
I think, unfortunately, this is a really sort of sad thing to have to say. I think the people who are most affected, on the most part, not exclusively, are people that politicians and parts of our media care less about. I'm talking about minoritized people of color, etc. Drug policy in the UK disproportionately negatively affects people of color, and I think there's a lack of political leadership in kind of moving away from those, I would say, the right-wing media narratives, but it goes beyond just the right-wing newspapers. And I think the other point is, unfortunately, our electoral system creates a situation where politicians think elections are won and lost on this kind of tiny section. Sort of, we call it like Middle England or the Red Wall or whatever it is, where marginal parliamentary seats exist. And I think that's the calculation that Keir Starmer is making. He thinks that I was born and brought up in a Red Wall constituency in the Northwest, and I think that the way that those people living in those constituencies are viewed is really patronising. Actually, I don't think they're as right wing and as populist as politicians like Keir Starmer seem to think. But until we have electoral reform, I think we're going to struggle to have a really sensible narrative from political leaders in the two main parties, that is, on drug policy.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I just finished off reading a book by Neil Woods. You may have heard of him. And I had no idea about this, but the UK was pretty much the pioneers of harm reduction. And before the Misuse of Drugs Act, in the 50s and 60s, there were actually doctors who distributed heroin and distributed drugs to addicts. And all the negative consequences that are attached to drugs were just not a thing back then.
Yeah, exactly. The stigma itself is one of the big problems. Even sometimes politicians who sort of mean well are still using stigmatizing language and almost like removing the agency from drug users and speaking about them as if they're kind of a scourge on society and so on. But yeah, Neil Woods is a friend. I was with him actually last week. Yeah, strongly recommend all his books.
Oh, they're brilliant. He has such an interesting perspective, and like I said, I didn't have a clue that the UK was actually like the pioneers of harm reduction. You wouldn't imagine it, given where we are now.
That's the thing that we've got. Sorry to interrupt, but we've got the health professionals who get this and understand. I mean, the BMA last week passed a motion, or the week before passed a motion, which might go to I think will go to their national conference. I don't quite understand how their sort of internal systems work. And so many health bodies across the world, but also in the UK, are kind of speaking out and saying that this is a policy that's just totally failed. It's just that our politicians are sort of this block,
Yeah, so disappointing. So in terms of looking forward, obviously we've had Canada decriminalize cannabis in recent times. The states in USA are starting to fall like dominoes as well, following that story. What could a regulated market in the UK look like for drugs or cannabis?
Yeah, I mean, I think, at Transform, we advocate for, all drugs pretty much to be legally regulated, but obviously that would be, it would be dependent on the drugs and the risks associated with them. Availability will be dependent on risk and so on. But I do think in the UK, it'll probably eventually start with cannabis legal regulation. And one of the dangers is that we sort of need to do it right. As Canada is an example where very large multinational companies have taken over the market. On balance, I still prefer people not to be being criminalized and so on for using cannabis or possessing cannabis. But when you have very large multinational companies taking over the market, I don't think that allows for a kind of health-based and social equity, social justice-based model to exist. And I'll go into a bit more detail about that. So actually, Transform, we're in an allyship with a social action network called Black Sox, who are a Black social action network. And we are working together to, ensure that, to sort of magnify the voice of people of colour in the context of drug policy in the UK, but also to ensure that when Transform are advocating for certain legal models and so on, we are informed by the need for kind of racial equity and social justice. So we went just over a year ago to New York, which was the latest US state to start rolling out licenses for legally regulated cannabis. And many people see the model in New York as the best so far in the US. Each one that introduces legislation kind of learns from the previous one. So New York being neighboring to Massachusetts. Massachusetts did their model, which introduced a lot of social equity, and then New York have kind of slightly bettered that one and so on. So in New York, one of the things that really impresses me is really embedded social equity into their model, which sort of means, various things. First of all, the licenses, a lot of the early licenses to sell cannabis are going to Black-led organizations, people who have been criminalized under Prohibition. So not only does that approach ensure that the people who were previously affected by Prohibition aren't going to be affected in the future, but it also builds in kind of reparations. So it starts to give opportunities, economic opportunities to people whose lives might have been ruined by Prohibition. And like one example in New York, the tax income from cannabis, which, there's a huge cannabis market in New York, so you can probably guess that'll be quite a
huge amount of tax revenue.
Yeah, I've heard estimates of like 1.25 billion.
Wow.
Like 6 years in New York for tax revenue, that is. And that tax revenue is split. 40% goes to public education, 20% goes to drug treatment and prevention programs, and then the other 40% goes to community grants reinvestment fund. So that is actually giving the money back to the communities, Black and brown people in the US who are most affected by Prohibition. So I would like to see a model like that in the UK, and that's what Transform will be, advocating for. And there'll be different challenges in the UK as the ones then that they encountered in New York. But what happened in New York? The legislators brought a bill forward, which I think it was 2019, which the advocates, the Drug Policy Alliance, who are kind of our equivalent in the US, that they didn't actually support it in the end because they said there wasn't enough social equity built into it. So for me, it's important that we get it right and we don't allow giant corporations to take over the market, because you'll have things like advertising, and it'll just become
That was my next question, really. So we do have one legalized drug. It's called alcohol, and it's marketed everywhere. When I'm watching football, it comes on at halftime. Guinness, Smirnoff vodka, whatever it might be. Do you think we should completely avoid that type of market?
Yeah, yeah.
But
I think one of the things that we would advocate for is to almost like learn from how we got it wrong with tobacco and alcohol,
yeah,
in you know, harm associated, and just the power that those big companies, big alcohol and tobacco companies have on lobbying, on advertising, and so on. And
yeah,
we know obviously it's not they've tightened up on the tobacco industry in particular in relation to advertising and so on. But alcohol, yeah, it's still this kind of huge behemoth of marketing and advertising and PR. And like you say, yeah, with football, and also there's thinking of gambling as well. And obviously that's sort of, but in football, just there's huge amounts of money associated with gambling, advertising, and so on. So yeah, I think we need to learn from those. And you know, at Transform, we're advocating for quite tight regulation.
right.
For yeah.
Yeah, I think it's so important because ultimately, with a free market capitalism, there's a massive profit incentive, and with that, companies obviously want to drive up revenues, increase their profits, and that means expanding their target market and increasing the amount of people that would take the drug. So
Exactly.
I think that measured approach is so important. I I I think another worry is when an industry becomes a behemoth like alcohol or tobacco, it almost gets too big to get reeled in, because
Yeah.
once the money starts talking, you get lobbying, as you discussed, you get politicians on board.
Yeah.
How do we keep this out of a drug market?
Yeah, and that's that. I mean, it exists a little bit in North America and you know other places where these big multinational companies control the market, and with Canada, because they already had, and a lot of jurisdictions that legally regulate cannabis already have medically available cannabis, and those companies you know can sort of swoop in and take over. But I think one way of guarding against it is limiting the size of companies that can get licenses. You can't you can't have giant multinational companies giving preferential treatment to things like cooperatives, you know, social clubs, cannabis social clubs like they have in Spain. And also, I think requiring companies who are coming into this emerging market to be transparent about who owns them, how much they spend on lobbying, and so on. Yeah, I think that those are just some of the measures, but I think it's really important that that they're put in place from the start. And actually, one of the interesting things about the US is the federal ban in the US on cannabis. So we're in this weird situation where lots of states have legally regulated cannabis, and yet there's still a federal ban. And I sort of, when I first thought about it, thought, oh, that that must be a bad thing. But actually, in some ways, it allows states to do it their own way without multinational companies coming in and just kind of taking over the market in every state.
Right.
So it actually makes it difficult to access finance and things like that. So in a way, that serves, and I'm not saying that's the solution to federally ban something and then legalize it at sort of regional level. But I know that drug policy campaigners in the US are actually worried about if legislation does remove the federal ban, what it will look like and how it will, will it have social equity built in? Will it limit the size of companies and so on? Because they fear big multinational, gigantic behemoth companies coming in and taking over the markets in individual states.
Yes, yeah, it's quite a concerning problem. It's something I hadn't really thought of, to be honest, until I listened to a TEDx talk quite recently about someone making the argument against regulating cannabis, and all those issues were listed off to do with, I guess, free market capitalism and the way companies, unfortunately end up taking the piss a bit.
What you said earlier, actually. So what you said earlier about alcohol advertising and the profit incentive. I can't remember the exact figure, but the most the people who give the most profits, it's like a huge proportion for alcohol companies are a small percentage of users who use a lot, basically. So there's a kind of small percentage of people who obviously drink a lot, who give something like 40% of the profits to alcohol companies. So the marketing approach isn't just, oh, let's try and get as many people as possible to drink a bit. It's let's really try and encourage the people who use alcohol the most to use it even more, which obviously in itself is problematic.
Yeah, I think there's some really tricky tactics, like really nasty slide tactics they use it. And going back to football, everything goes back to football with this world, unfortunately. I saw an advert as Bet365, and for me, I kind of see the gambling industry in a similar light to the tobacco and alcohol industry in terms of it can be very damaging to people's livelihoods. And for the last 30, 40 years, they've been promoting their product, promoting it nonstop. Now they promote it, but in the actual 30-second advert, they're almost telling you to, I guess, limit your use. And they're trying to tell you not to gamble when if you're depressed or if you're in a bad state of mind. It's such a weird, I don't know, it doesn't sit right with me, because ultimately they want you to use their product. But at the same time, they're trying to be ethical.
Exactly.
And I don't know.
Thing, their profit models. I don't know exactly for gambling, but I every now and then bet on football through Bet365 or one of the other apps. But it's probably £5 a month on average or something. There's no way I am one of their target customers. Their target customers are people who maybe have problematic gambling and want to bet regularly, and they're even if they kind of shield their intent under these positive messages that they're required to do, that their target are the people who bet regularly, because that's where they get it. So
yeah, such an important aspect to consider. Outside of the US, are there any other examples that you think where countries not nailed it but got it pretty spot on in terms of their approach to drugs, drug policy, decriminalisation?
Portugal has talked a lot about in relation to decriminalisation of possession, which has led to a significant fall in drug-related deaths and a reduction in the prison population. But obviously, they don't have legally regulated cannabis or other drugs. It's just decriminalisation. But I do think it's definitely a start. And we're quite positive. One of my colleagues has been working closely with the Maltese government, who are currently legally regulating cannabis. There's work in Colombia now to legalize coca, which when I was in there's something called the UN Commission for Narcotic Drugs, which is we call CMD, but every year they have all the member states have delegations and drug policy experts and advisors and NGOs go and so on. And the Colombian delegation had lots of Colombian ministers, and they were speaking at various events and stuff and saying really positive things. So that was pretty impressive. And then Germany are soon to be going down the route of legally regulating cannabis, which we think, because Germany is a country that I think in the UK we see as quite sensible. There's this idea in the UK that crazy things happen in the US and we're very different from the US, even though we speak the same language, have very similar popular culture kind of references and reference points. I do think that Germany taking this step will make people in the UK, politicians and decision makers, think twice, and I think that will have a powerful impact. And again, Transformer working with people in Germany on that as well.
But sorry, I think I missed it. Are generally decriminalizing, or are they actually regulating?
Yeah, legally regulating. Usually, decriminalisation will come into it as well. But obviously with Portugal, they've just decriminalised drugs so that people who are possessing drugs are personally wouldn't be prosecuted. And legal regulation is kind of the next step so that people can, have licenses to sell and so on.
Yeah, I find the Portugal case really interesting and quite bizarre at the same time. It's great they've decriminalized, and I saw these amazing statistics of the HIV rates falling by 90%. But
yeah,
on the other side of the coin, I think you also need to regulate and actually produce the drugs yourself, because at the end of the day, the drug users in Portugal are still getting it from the gangs, and with that, there's this cascade of violence and negative consequences on society. So I think it's really important. It's not just it's not a zero-sum game. You don't have to choose one or the other. They've got to work together in tandem.
And that would be the ideal. Yeah, that would be the ideal. And actually, I mean, in the UK, we do have some areas that don't, some police forces, for example, that don't prosecute people for possession of cannabis.
Yeah.
And say it doesn't mean that people aren't, having to get cannabis from drug dealers and so on. So yeah.
The regulation aspect just makes so much sense. I mean, the drugs people get are often made in someone's garage, laced with God knows what. The person making it probably has no idea about the potency and the correct levels of mixing drugs. I saw a recent study that said that 60% of MDMA in the UK market is 3 times above the recommended potency level, to the point where it's almost like considered lethal. It's just crazy to me. It's like students. I've just finished university, and I can safely say students are going to take drugs whether they're legal or illegal, and it just makes zero sense to put this burden to make it such a dangerous activity, where when you have the option to make tax revenue on it, and B, also reduce the harms on society.
And actually, Transform, we have a campaign called Anyone's Child. I don't know if you've heard of it, but Anyone's Child is a network of families, mostly parents, campaigning for a change to our drug laws, because usually, not always, they've had a family member who's died, following unsafe supply of drugs. So it could be an ecstasy pill that they thought was, they'd taken ecstasy pills many times before and they were safe, and this was like, 50 times the safe dose. And that's a really powerful argument for legal regulation, because of safe supply, as we call it, so that you can know what you're taking. You can actually have sort of harm reduction, health and safety messages on packaging and things like that. It's important.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've spoken to quite a few people about it, and people are it's like Marmites. People either love the idea or hate it. There's some people who just think that regulating drugs and allowing people to purchase it from a pharmacy is just going to massively increase the usage. I'm not sure I agree with it. I just think I think it's a bit of a silly argument.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, at Transform, we sort of have a bit of a joke in our office that we want to make drugs boring. So we want kind of boring packaging. We want lots of health measures, health and safety information on the packaging, contents, all that kind of stuff. And there's no evidence that drug use will go up, but there's a huge amount of evidence that the things that people are taking, which they would take anyway, as you said, are safer, and they'll at least know what they are.
The UK is, in my opinion, is culturally pretty conservative in many aspects. We've just discussed the US and their approach to cannabis. Do you think culturally people would accept it here in the UK, or do you think this is something which needs decades in terms of education to almost warm people up to the idea that regulating a drug market is actually a pretty good idea?
Yeah, it's a good question. I do think that I agree with you that Britain is quite culturally conservative, and people have views about drugs and drug use that just aren't founded in reality. And it might take time, but I do think that we're making progress. The conversation conversations we have at Transform are very different to how they were before my time at Transform, but years ago. And we are, I think, moving in the right direction. And I do think actually the having people like our Anyone's Child campaigners, for example, in the conversation, often these are, people who you wouldn't think would be campaigners for legal regulation of drugs, which I think is important, having a whole range of voices campaigning for change, because, we at Transform, even though we don't really come across this way, but might be sort of dismissed as, hippies or, which isn't how we are at all. I mean, we want to get drugs under control rather than, the free for all that exists now, the dangerous route. But yeah, I think having a range of voices campaigning is really, really helpful. And actually, when we talk to politicians and we meet politicians, there seems to be a general acceptance that the Misuse of Drugs Act has failed, and then the next step is convincing politicians about how we do it differently. Then what the best approach is, and that's a challenge.
Have you guys had any contact with the police? Like, do you speak to the police? Do you know what their point of view is on our current approach towards drugs, since they're at the forefront of this?
We work quite closely with Neil Woods and LEAP, which is the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, which is former police officers who are campaigning for change. And we do work with lots of police forces in the UK. Now, the challenge is current police officers aren't really supposed to say that they disagree with the laws because they're there to enforce them. So privately, people will say, yeah, this is crazy, this is not the best use of our resources, etc. But the other challenge is, and this, I was actually speaking to a former police officer quite recently, who's a youngish woman who used to be in the Metropolitan Police. The way that policing is kind of measured, your kind of outputs and your performance targets and your performance goals is often about how many arrests you do and things like that. And obviously, it's quite easy to someone, stop and search someone and arrest them. It gets those numbers up. So there is this kind of perverse incentive built into performance, really. Right. Makes it challenging. So even if lots of police officers say that, particularly former police officers that I talk to say that, I was arresting these people or stopping and searching people, and I knew that it was senseless, but I sort of needed to do it because that's how I'm being measured. My performance is being measured. Which is fundamentally problematic.
Yeah, I mean, it's so problematic. I mean, if the incentives are completely misaligned, it leads to, I guess, all these racial tensions that we've seen, with Brixton riots back in the 80s and 90s. What are some of the goals of the work you guys are doing at Transform? It's so interesting. You guys have this, you have so many policy papers on a roadmap on how to regulate cannabis, or psychedelics, or most drugs. What are your goals?
You mentioned psychedelics. So our next, we've done the cannabis book, which is now translated into lots of languages. Got the 3rd edition that came out last year. We also have a how to regulate stimulants book, which lots of sort of governments and so on have seen that. And the next area that we're looking into is how to regulate psychedelics. So we're in the next months we'll be finishing our kind of pamphlet. It won't be a full-length book, but our pamphlet on how to regulate psychedelics for non-medical use, which will be quite exciting. And you may have heard there's a lot of people talking about psychedelics.
Yeah, definitely.
But mainly for their kind of therapeutic use, their medical use. And we want to, the vast majority of people who use psychedelics use them, recreationally, use them for, sorry, it was an ice cream van outside. It's not, medical use isn't sort of the largest use. So, even though most of the conversations are centering around that, actual use for non-medical purposes is the vast majority of psychedelic use. So it's really important that we talk about that. Another thing we're doing at Transform now is, as well as advising lots of governments internationally, we're also working on the ground in the UK to sort of change practice in relation to things like tolerated use in hostels and changing policing approaches and things. But we are also trying to take conversations about drug policy reform into sort of unexpected places. So we've been having some conversations with leaders in the Christian faith in the Church of England, just to try and bring on board more sort of allies, I guess, more people who support drug policy reform, because I think we and others have come to the conclusion that unless public opinion shifts, and continues to shift in relation to drug policy reform, I don't think politicians will show the level of leadership and move before they feel it would be popular to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way you guys lay out the information is so simple. Anyone, any idiot like me can read it and understand what you guys are trying to achieve. And I think it's brilliant because no one's ever converted someone to their side by shouting at them and calling them an idiot. People only really change their minds if they're spoken to like a human and they're represented with facts. And I think that's exactly what you guys do. And there isn't, as far as I'm concerned, a strong case against what you guys are advocating for.
Yeah, well, you seem to know a lot, so don't play down your level of knowledge. But yeah, I think it's really important that we provide strong arguments that are kind of academically rigorous, but also we add in the kind of human side of it, because you're absolutely right that people will only change their opinion if they're presented with facts and a strong argument. But equally, I think people will only almost like become interested in potentially changing their opinion if they understand the human cost of the alternative. Yeah,
absolutely. You touched on a really interesting point a couple of minutes back, was psychedelics. This space is fascinating. I've read quite a lot about veterans using MDMA and microdosing mushrooms, psilocybin, to offset their PTSD. Is this do you feel like people view psychedelics a bit differently to cannabis and heroin?
I think that's a good question. I mean, I think different people use different drugs for different reasons, and I think we can't sort of move away from the fact that people use drugs because it has a positive effect for them. It makes them feel more relaxed, or it makes them it takes away trauma or whatever. A lot of people use drugs to sort of self-medicate, and certainly there's evidence that psychedelics can have quite a profound impact for some people. And I know, actually, I don't know if you saw, Neil Woods recently wrote an article maybe a week ago saying police officers should, as part of their professional development, or whatever, use psychedelics to cope with trauma associated with being a police officer. And I think Neil was trying to, in a way, I mean obviously he believes that, but it's quite a provocative concept. But yeah, I think there's loads of evidence that people use psychedelics for because it makes them feel good, because it transforms them to a place where they feel better and so on. And actually, one of the interesting aspects of psychedelics is it's a completely different risk profile to most other drugs. So I mean, I guess cannabis as well, but it is different to some other drugs. But people don't die of an overdose because of psychedelics. People, the sort of most immediate danger associated with psychedelics is people have a trip that kind of is disturbing or is unpleasant. So harm reduction in a psychedelics context is quite different to some other drugs.
Yeah, 100%. Are there any examples of where psychedelics have been regulated successfully? Do they do it in the US or?
I as far as I know, it's available. To be honest, I don't actually know. I don't think non-medical psychedelic use is available. Certainly in big economies like ours. Obviously, psychedelics historically have a use in with indigenous populations in different countries and so on, and as part of sort of faith-based rituals and things like that. And until quite recently, magic mushrooms were not illegal in the UK because they, grow naturally. And I think it was the 90s that magic mushrooms became illegal. So it's not
Yeah.
actually that long ago they were legal. But yeah, psychedelics historically have been used in lots of kind of religious practices and so on.
No, it's fascinating stuff. Just backpedaling a little bit back to when we were talking about police and their approach to drugs. What how do you think police should tackle problematic users and people who clearly have issues with drugs?
Well, I don't think it should be a matter for police, really. I mean, obviously, if police see someone who's had an overdose, then they need to do something. But what I suggest they do is it's a health issue, and they call 999 and let an ambulance deal with it. I don't think drug policy should kind of sit within criminal justice. I think it should sit within health, and that will be a fundamental shift. But sort of criminalizing people, or even police kind of arresting people and directing people to services and things, all of that is problematic for something which is fundamentally a health issue.
Absolutely. I recently did a podcast with someone called Peter Criken. I'm not sure if you heard of him. Yeah, he's amazing. He was telling me his stories of how he'd drive around Glasgow in his renovated ambulance and let people safely inject. But unfortunately, there are times where the police were just waiting for him, and as soon as the users came out of a van, they would then bust them. So it's
just crazy. I mean, Peter, actually, the ambulance that he had is now transformed, has that ambulance.
Oh, no way.
We tour it around the country as kind of a demonstration of what Peter did in Scotland. So it's still, internally, it's still exactly like it was when Peter was using it. And we took it to Parliament, we took it to the Senate, all over, to show, what can be done and what harm reduction can look like and how many lives it can save and so on. We work very closely with Peter.
Yeah, the whole harm reduction, what it's about and how it can really transform a drug addict's life, drug user's life, is fascinating. But our current system of just locking people up for taking heroin, I think it's 50% of our prison population are locked up due to drug related offences. So talk about releasing the burden on a prison system as well. The system's on its knees, and for stupid reasons.
I saw was 38% of people, but it's like specifically for drug related issues, but also anything that's kind of drug related crime as well. So 38% is the figure I have. But yeah, it's a huge proportion of people in prison. And if you look at racial disproportionality as well, Black people are 8 times more likely to be stopped and searched, far more likely to be prosecuted if arrested with possession of drugs and so on. So
yeah, it's absolutely crazy. Yes. Well, Alex, thanks for joining me tonight. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I really appreciate the work you guys do. Like I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, I really urge anyone listening to go onto the website and just look at the publications, because they even do summaries of how to regulate the cannabis market, psychedelics. It's in bullet points, and it's so simple and it's so easy to understand. So I appreciate the work you guys are doing.
Thank you so much, and keep having these conversations. It's really great that you've had Peter and other guests on, because you often can't have a kind of sensible just a sensible adult conversation about drug policy and drug use without it being kind of sensationalized or so on. So it's great, these conversations. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for coming on. I'll leave a link in the description below to transform drug policy. Are there any other links that you want me to leave below?
There's also, if you could leave Anyone's Child website as well, which is part of Transform, but that's where we have our activist network. So if there's anyone who's been affected themselves by drug prohibition and they want to help this campaign change, or if they just want to join our activist network, we have an annual lobby of Parliament. If anyone wants to come that's in July. It's the Anyone's Child website.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for joining me tonight, Alex, and If you guys enjoyed listening to the episode, please consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.